Probably three things I'd like to share with you, and then I'd be interested to have a discussion with you. First of all, I'm a student of history, love history. I like all forms of history, and I'm interested, of course, in our own nation's history, both ancient and modern. But 140 years of Salvo is also some matter of history. I remember studying at university when I was studying the development of Melbourne in colonial times, about the rise of, and then also studying, of course, studying in England, the rise of Christian socialism, the rise of progressive movements to deal with some of the ills of the Industrial Revolution. And William Booth has a very interesting story. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But he saw a lot of incredible poverty as an apprentice pawnbroker. That is an ideal place to identify poverty. So he decided to create an army to serve the world. It's a sort of bold mission, isn't it? And I'm very conscious, though, that you all endeavour to do that, to serve the world, day in, day out. And I know that you're having a discussion about, who are the Salvos and what does that all mean. I just want to encourage you in that discussion. My first point is that you sometimes don't need to reinvent everything, because I think your original purpose still stands true. Now, how you deliver it, sure, that can always be updated, but I think that some of those values of the late 19th century still remain true. The need to assist others, that sense of duty. It was very interesting to see that Catherine Booth believed in preaching and bringing equality for women in the ministry and leadership in the Salvation Army. I love the fact that from Edward Saunders and John Gore holding a street meeting in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens in 1880, to now you have a presence in almost every city, town and rural community. It's quite extraordinary. Gore's invitation to take into his home and feed those who hadn't a square meal, I think that still echoes today, doesn't it? I'll come back to that. The fact that James and Alice Barker had the Prison Gate Brigade started a history of social services that is absolutely to be applauded. So my first proposition this morning, in your generous invitation to join you today, was that the way you deliver your values may change, but some values remain consistent. And I think that idea of service for others and service for the disadvantaged and the dispossessed and those without a voice remains, I think, a constant contemporary role. The second proposition I briefly wanted to touch on before I get to all of you is that there was a former minister in the Hawke and Keating governments, Reverend the Honourable Professor Brian Howe. He and his amazing wife Renata wrote a paper in 2012 called The Influence of Faith-Based Organisations in Australia's Social Policy. He's an ordained Uniting Church minister. He serves parishes in Eltham, Morwell and Fitzroy. He argued in his paper that it was the rejection of the English poor laws model in Australian colonies that changed the societal and political landscape of welfare. It's, again, you may recall that the poor laws model was actually a Tudor-era social welfare policy, probably brought back to life by Mr Morrison. No, I joke. Joke-ish, sort of. They got a laugh. But it's interesting. I digress. My dad is from the northeast of England, very sort of modest background. Grew up in the Depression and went to sea. But at one of his visits back to England, they found a family tree, and I didn't realise how many of my people came from the same town, W House, until I realised that there were just workhouses all over England that my family came from. So I'm very glad that in fact, on the other side, my first ancestors who came here were convicts. So they made the British legal system rich. I'm sure they were innocent, but they came out here too, the Minahans. But I do think that this nation has become a nation of the second chance, and I think in modern Australian history, and I think that's a pretty strong proposition. And we developed our own approach. Now, I care to believe we developed our own approach on 8 hours rest, 8 hours study and 8 hours work. We established a debate about the minimum wage in this country long before other countries really did. And we established that we wanted to do our welfare differently to the poor laws and the workhouses of England. But what I also realise is that in the colony of Victoria, for example, just as it was the Mercy Nuns who set up the first schools, the faith-based organisations have filled a gap as we've evolved our welfare system, and you still remain fundamental to the delivery of that safety net. So there are two propositions, that faith-based organisations, I think, have a very creditable record in assistance of people who are disadvantaged. You know, that's a sort of fairly anemic term, disadvantaged, but people who are dispossessed, without power, without voice in our community. And of course, your original mission of the values which founded, I still think, have plenty of opportunity for contemporary expression. So, having said those two introductory points, the role of faith-based and I think the importance of some of the founding values of your organisation, we get to the current era. And it's a pretty interesting question that you're engaging in. What's your purpose now? I think all organisations need to ask that question periodically to refresh the vision. Are we, you know, why do we get up in the morning? What is the value that we contribute which someone else doesn't contribute? In public life, I've had a test, funnily enough, which I worked out of my tort law books when I was a student at Monash University. I did fail tort law the first time, but I certainly mastered it the second time round. And it's funny, having helped the class action on robo-debt, I'm not sure my initial torts law professor Trinde would have thought I was capable of even explaining what a tort was. It's still the biggest class action in Australian history. But there was a test in tort law which was used to explain whether or not a particular incident could create a basis of negligence. It was, is there a duty of care? Was there a breach of the duty of care? And did damage arise from the breach of the duty of care? And I think it was Lord Denning of the English legal system fame, I think, who looked at a test which apparently a painter on the side of a ship in a dockyard dropped a cigarette or dropped a hammer, and that sent a series of cascading events which led to an injury of someone who was below the aforesaid painter. And it said, but for this action, would the injury have occurred? But I like this context of but for in a different way. In my engagement in politics, and I wouldn't seek to talk to you about your lives, but in my life, I've learned that there are things which I do, which if I didn't get up in the morning and do them, frankly, someone else would. But periodically you get the gift, you get the privilege of doing things that, but for you doing it, would not have happened. So I think this but-for test is a pretty valuable test. What are the things that we do which, but for us doing them, would not have occurred? And I think that's a valuable question for an organisation based on the excellent values that you have been based on. What are the things that we do that, but for us, would not have occurred? So, I just first, and in that, then let me go to you, remembering that but-for test and your historic values. Many of you are social workers. Now, I've been a union rep, I'm very proud of that. I've represented shearers and underground gold miners and oil rig workers and jockeys and gardeners. Quite interesting, really. But many of them work with their intellect and they work with their physical energy. But some people go to work and work not just with their physical energy and their intellectual energy, but they work with their emotional energy. It's called emotional labour. People who work with others, you work with your emotional labour as well. And that can be quite tiring sometimes because you've always got to be up. If you're supporting a vulnerable person who's doing it hard, they will take their cues from you. Yes, the kids may have been nightmares this morning and wouldn't eat their lunch or, pack their lunch or wouldn't, get off their iPhone or just their breathing, which is a good thing, but that's unreservedly a good thing, but you know what I mean? But then you've got to go to work and you cannot afford, you're human beings. You live a life which is more than just your work, no matter how important your vocation is. But you've always got to be up. It is very tiring to always be up. It's draining, but you've got to do it because there's other people counting on your equilibrium, your emotional energy. So you work with your emotional energy and that's a really important gift you give people, and I recognise it. So understanding what you bring, and you don't have to be a social worker to do that, there's plenty of you just do that generally. You know, my friend Brendan Noddle, he's just annoyingly up all the time. Major Sandra must find that tiring, but anyway. So what are the things that you can do that but for you doing it wouldn't happen? And I think that's an interesting proposition. So where are the gaps in our society? Where are people falling through the net? I believe that that social security, welfare, is a human right. I do not have a workhouse view of the people doing it hard. It could be any of us at any time. You know, we live in our world of work and we live in our world at home. It's like the four wheels of a car. But if your work all of a sudden becomes off balance, or if your home life becomes off balance, all of a sudden that car's not on the road anymore. So every Australian, every human being is entitled to the human right of the safety net. So there's still too many Australians who lead lives of disempowerment. I know that when I was helping create the National Disability Insurance Scheme, what I discovered about the lives of people with disability in my first term of government, I mean, I thought I'd seen unfair treatment when I was a union rep, and I had. But what I didn't realise is the invisible life of exile that people with disability and their carers were living in our own society, right in front of me. It's as if there was a giant walled city inside with people with disability. Poorer, more time-constrained, life's just harder. Carers can't work, no savings for retirement, that midnight anxiety of ageing carers when they finish drying the dishes at midnight, looking out over the window out of their back, you know, their back kitchen sink, wondering who's going to love their adult child with disabilities when they no longer can. So we've set up a National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's now the best in the world. It's got its challenges, I really know that, trust me. But now I'm the minister for it. No good deed goes unpunished. But it's amazing. Do you know, it's going to be around 2.3% of GDP. This is a country who spends as much on the profoundly disabled as we do on defence. I'm proud of that. The rest of the world looks at us. That was a gap which I, and then I organised others, we identified. And it provides individual packages of support. It's a nice left-right idea, if you like. The left idea, generous support. The right idea, let individuals be in charge of the allocation of their resources. Trust people. Because the great problem for people with disability, and dare I say it for all disadvantaged people, dare I say it even for people in this room, is it's not the impairment or the particular addiction or the particular circumstance. It's a lack of money and a lack of power. You know, unfairly, the News Limited used to accuse me of being a class warrior. I'm not, but you know what? I have the itch under my skin when I think something's unfair. I just keep itching it. Sometimes I just can't shake my head out of the notion that something's unfair. I'm not a crusader, but I do fundamentally, if I think something's right and something's wrong, I cannot let go of that idea. It's an affliction. I'm not saying I always get it right, I'm not saying I pick every issue. But the big challenge, I think, in modern Australia is a lack of money and a lack of power for people. And people fall through the gaps. There are people off the grid, not because they choose to be off the grid, because they just can't get onto it. We're doing very exciting work with our Project 614. We now have a full-time Centrelink official who, very switched-on person, Nick Carbines. Instead of the project people having to join people up to the system, Medicare, Centrelink, we've just outplaced one of the very highly trained, switched-on people, and so we just join people up to the system. People who wouldn't think of going to an office, wouldn't go online, they're now joining up. Now we've rolled this out to 18 different frontline organisations around Australia. We're now doing that with the NDIS, putting officials at the centre so that people who might be eligible, we can spot and help them get into the system. We're now even getting the Hearing Australia van to turn up to test people's hearing. It's fantastic. Last week when we were launching it, one of the people who frequently uses the centre came up and showed me his new hearing aids that he'd been diagnosed for a couple of weeks earlier. The audiologist was in the room upstairs. He's got his hearing aids. You know, if your ability to hear, things that perhaps we take for granted, just to make a massive difference. So my concluding observation to you is, where are the gaps? I can volunteer views to you, but you're capable of identifying the gaps. But that is the question to ask. What are the things that if we didn't do it wouldn't happen? Where are the gaps of unfairness? Where is a lack of money and a lack of power creating ridiculous outcomes, unfair outcomes? Food insecurity? And that's a massive issue, basic. People's lack of connection. When I think about it, that could also be who are the people who, get ignored? Let me tell you some of them. It's the mentally ill. It is foreign students. It's people zipping around on those scooters delivering their stuff. Who's looking after them? They can't vote. They sort of pay taxes, but not really. People with disabilities are still doing it hard. Then also, I think there's just older Australians. Then there's the lonely. So we also now live at a time where the energy prices are up, where rent is up if you can get a rental. By the way, that list of people missing out is not exclusive. I'm sure you can add others. There's First Australians, there's the homeless, you get the list. But we've now got the income anxious. I just want to know, how do we create inclusion? I think one of the gaps that we have is, who are the people that everyone else put in the too hard basket? They may have challenging behaviours. They may require extra work. They may have long and boring stories, which, you have to deal with, and I can nick off and occasionally, but, give a bit of attention. But these are people still doing it pretty hard. So I feel very precocious, even putting to all of you who spend every day working, and I'm sure you already all passed the but-for test. In fact, I'm very sure you do. So I do feel precocious volunteering. That connection to your values, how do you demonstrate them in a contemporary fashion? There is a role for faith-based organisations, always has. But I do also challenge you to think, where are the gaps? Who are the people in the too hard basket? I'll finish on perhaps a classic example of it. Our dental system doesn't really work in Australia. People's dental health's crap. If you don't have money, it's just a nightmare. Medicare doesn't cover it. In the 2019 election, I valiantly thought about trying to extend dental care, but anyway, Queensland picks ScoMo. You got to wear it. I don't know if that's the Queenslanders laughing most. But in all seriousness, dental care's a gap. The gaps are there. We've just got to bother to try and fill them. Thanks very much for letting me share my views. Thanks for what you do.
Sit down briefly and we'll do. Bill has agreed to take some questions, and Jenny will take the microphone around, and I'm sure many of you will have questions for Bill. It's very generous of you to do this. You need to borrow my mic.
Just when we talk about questions, I'm very relaxed about you just giving a deeply held view that you've bored your family with, and you can just say at the end of it, do I agree? Okay.
Okay.
And there's one other trick I know on Talkback Radio. If you say Mr. Shorten, it means you're not my friend. If you say Bill, you probably like me.
Right. But what if you're just casual, Bill?
It's a Talkback.
We'll take it. We'll look. The topic of your address was collaborative partnerships involving government and faith-based organisations. I just have a couple of questions to kick off. I remember, this ages us both, when the Howard government came to power, there was, I think, the privatisation of employment services. Where do you think, the sweet spot lies between what government provides and what NGOs provide, especially though if NGOs effectively become an outgrowth of government, subject, appropriately so, to a lot of guidelines and rules, but where do you think the sweet spot applies?
If the universe grants the ability to travel back to the past and reconsider actions, I probably wouldn't have privatised
the Commonwealth Employment Service. Well, at the universe, I haven't found that time machine yet, because there'll be a couple other things I'll rectify too. But I think, for me, the challenge in employment services is not being a tick box employment service provider, not placing the easy to place people. What we really need is the more difficult to place people. Not, by the way, difficult in the long run, but perhaps requiring more work to get them ready. We've got to change employer attitudes. A lot of HR departments think that when you employ someone with not a big work history, that's a lot of extra HR work for them. So I think it's about focusing on the person you're trying to assist, and it's supporting them not just to get into the job, but whilst they're there. So I think the metrics of how we remunerate service-based employment organisations should be based on longevity in the job, not just number of training courses completed. Also, I think that employment services who want to find people traditionally who are disproportionately not successful in the labour market, like, for example, people with intellectual disability. I just think that focus on the hard-to-place people, focus on connection, longevity in employment rather than just short-term milestones. Now, it'd be great if the government asked you to do that, but don't wait for the government to ask you to do it. Where's the real need? The other group I think are really important are older Australians. You know, there's not a shopping centre I don't go to where, you know, an impeccably dressed person in their 60s comes up to me and says, I've done 20 interviews, I can never get a job. So I'd love to see an employment service provider say our speciality is older people, or our speciality is people in cohorts of Australians who traditionally have very low rates of employment. Do the difficult jobs. Leave the easy jobs to other people. I know that's easy for me to say, but that's what I think.
Yeah. The other argument that was made, which I must say at the time I found slightly persuasive, was that people in faith-based organisations and NGOs would bring that extra level of enthusiasm. Because, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, people weren't just doing these jobs for the income. As important, as critical as the income is, there was an added level of motivation. I'm not sure how that has worked out over the past quarter century, but I'm wondering if you have a thought about that level of thinking.
I think certainly that there are a lot of motivated people, but let's also go and tell some truth bombs. Religious organisations have had their fair share of bad people too.
Quite.
There's people who preach Christianity on a Sunday and don't practice it any other day of the week. I don't really want to know how holy you are. I respect you have faith. I've been raised in the Christian faith. I'm interested in what you do every day, not what you say on Sunday. So there can be hypocrisy. Mind you, there can be in government, trust me. I've sat there for 16 years. I also think that view's a little harsh on the people in the public service. There's some fantastic people, many of them. I now have responsibility for Service Australia. There are a lot of great people doing amazing stuff. So I think that view that somehow faith-based organisations or the NGO sector was manifestly superior and more motivated than the front line of the CES, I don't think that's quite fair. But having said that, when an NGO, a faith-based organisation, is working well and true to its values, that's just excellent. But I never assume that, for instance, my political party is the only party with good people in it. So always be careful of assuming, I'm not saying you are, but moral superiority by virtue of it's your deeds, not your words, that I think give you that sense of collaborativeness. It's not the particular person or thing, entity you worship. Yeah.
I'm just going to sneak in one more question before we go to the audience. You said something there that triggered this thought in me. You said that News Corp accused you of being a class warrior. I don't think you were either, but I do want to ask you about why, because it does go to the broader question here. The Prime Minister has used this phrase that his government is guided by the principle, no one left behind, no one held back. Do you think, though, Bill, when it comes to the question of no one held back, that there are certain entities, individuals, that need to make something more of a contribution?
We're all on a journey about what we think. You know, it'll be interesting for each one of you, if I knew all your backstories, when did you develop the value set that you think guide you now? Could have been in your childhood, could have been your parents, could have been an experience at work, it could have been something you learned, it could have been just people you've met, things you've seen. And whilst our values can form early on, they do evolve. And I don't mean in a bad way necessarily, I just mean you learn more and you see what works and you have more life experience. So I've evolved to a person, I just believe in merit. What I understand is merit doesn't come in a suit, doesn't come by what school you went to, it doesn't come by who you love, it doesn't come by how much money you have in the bank, it doesn't come by how long your family have lived in Australia. Merit cannot be predicted by your gender. Merit cannot be predicted by whether or not you worship someone or something, or in fact no one. And what I don't like about the organisation society sometimes is people with merit, people with something to contribute, don't get heard because they're black, or because they're women, or because they're non-binary, or because their parents were refugees, or because they don't have a lot of money, or because they barrack for Collingwood even. But, you know, merit comes in all shapes and forms. And so what I like to do is remove the barriers which let people demonstrate their merit. And by the way, I think most people have merit. Most people are good at something. Perhaps when people have been growing up, they got more frowns than smiles over the side of the cot. I don't know. Perhaps people have come through some traumatic experience and it's knocked them for six. But I just think that we all, you know, my political rivals talk about equal opportunity, but then they have, you know, in one of the terms of Parliament, they had more Andrews than women on the front bench. Literally, there were more men called Andrew than they had women on the front bench. And we've all got more to learn about that. So I don't begrudge wealth. I respect hard work. Absolutely. And that's, you know, I respect the contribution that everyone makes to the economy. I respect the contribution that everyone makes to society. But what I always try and do is see the person and not perhaps some of the external rubbish which gets in the way. And what that means is that when I think people are pulling their weight or not pulling their weight, I think that the things which get in the way of every individual being able to fulfil their own agency are what bug me. And inevitably that leads to a discussion on the tax system or other things. Why is it the case in Australia that property is taxed more lightly than income? Why is it that we seem to struggle with the notions of affirmative action? Well, not all of us, but some do. Why is it that we judge people very quickly based on, you know, how much money they have rather than who they are? So I like merit, and there's merit in just about every human being I've ever met, and the trick is just to have a system which lets that emerge rather than keeping people down.
This Andrew is going to yield the floor now. Jenny? That's all right, Jenny's got the microphone.
Hi.
Yep, just introduce yourself briefly and...
Yes. My name's Rovind from Moneicare, sort of financial counselling, financial inclusion, financial capability, and all those arenas. You talked about Bill, about addressing you. I was thinking about that actually. Bill or Bill Shorten, but here, this question is going to follow with my quick scenario here. It is dedicated to Honourable Bill Shorten in the minister role, I guess, now and leader of opposition at the time and stuff. So it's around gambling and the harm. And I guess I'm going to share my example. I used to be a binge gambler at one time, probably 30 years ago. Please don't judge me anymore. I don't do it anymore. But yeah, at the time, I would, while going to work, I'll go and spend $100. My family didn't know, no one knew. And then all of a sudden, I landed a job in Saudi Arabia. And you probably see where I'm getting at. It's illegal over there. There's no alcohol. I used to drink as well. I wasn't a heavy drinker, so don't judge me again, please. But yes, I used to sort of do my things. And when I landed there, everything's illegal. No gambling, no alcohol. In fact, I have seen heads chopped off, serious stuff if you are doing all the wrong stuff. Coming back to Australia after serving 2 years there, I'm clean, and it's been 30 years, never looked back. My question, I've been asking this in numerous forums, how hard it is to ban gambling here. As simple as, and this is from speaking from board of director level that I've served, have this opportunity in Manicare and other spaces and all that. Like I go to so many countries clean, and they're third world countries. If they've got those values, what's happening? Like, and I'm picking this up from the too hard basket. So it's the too hard basket I wanted to probably, I'm taking on to myself, and I haven't found the right spaces, and I hope I'll one day find before I die.
Thank you. I'm not sure I want to go the full Saudi as a general rule. I'm glad that worked for you. Thanks for sharing your journey, though. Maybe we have similar personalities. I think if I punt. I don't think I punt very much. I drink too much. Some personalities, I think, respond to that sort of boot camp, complete abstinence, can't do it approach. I suspect I'd be like you. I'd probably benefit from that. But I think one of the things we can do, which gets put in the too hard basket, is it's the clinics of support. When a person is addicted, and many of you know far more about this and you've worked on it far more than I do, but it's just a sort of lay observer who's followed a lot of these matters now for decades. I think that when someone who is addicted wants to change, that's when we've got to have the intervention. So I think that without, as I said, metaphorically going the full Saudi, I think that we should have, and maybe this is something you guys can do, when people want to change, that's when they need the help. And they don't need the help 1,000 kilometres from where they live. They need it in their towns. But people who are addicted, be it to substance, gambling or other things, they're not always easy to help, but I think it's that time when that person's ready to make the change, or at least might think they're up for the change, when they've hit rock bottom and they realise there's a part of them says, this just doesn't feel right. It's those sort of clinics. It's not just chucking them in jail or putting them in a hospital. It's how do you help people? But that's a resource-intensive proposition. I will, when we hear some other points, I'm just going to make one. Well, okay, I'll say it now. What's the property portfolio of the Salvos like? Is it big? Okay, well, that's great. But is the job of the Salvos to have a big property portfolio? Anyway, that's beyond my pay grade.
Just before we go, it's not a matter of go the full Saudi. I want to go the full Sydney in the sense that gentleman raised a very good question about gambling. Bill, what's your thoughts on poker machine regulation? Because it's of huge interest, I suspect, to people in this room, and I know in New South Wales it was an issue that convulsed the last state election campaign. Just give us an honest assessment of how we should regulate poker machines.
I think it's one of the things which killed the Gillard government. In 2011, we proposed networked solutions and all of the reforms, and I think it damaged us heavily with Labor seats. So my point is it's a pretty difficult issue.
Yeah, but you're pretty honest about this. I mean, okay, it damaged Labor politically, but you also know that there's a moral purpose to Labor. I think of all the Labor leaders, you are very aware that there's a moral purpose to Labor.
It's a balance,
so what's
though.
the moral risk that you've got to take?
If you can't form a government, that's a problem too. And it's just a matter of how many issues you want to carry at one time. I took a platform in opposition in 2019 of fixing up our tax system and making that fairer. I think that was it was a good fight, but maybe we had one too many changes in our kit bag. I think the gambling industry, I'm not talking about perhaps the big gamblers, but the pubs and the clubs, I think you've got to have engagement with them. You just got to keep working with them day by day. And somehow they've, North Melbourne never went for pokies. North Melbourne Football Club, the people from the New South Wales and Queensland, it's an AFL sport. It's not British. And they've suffered ever since because they don't have the revenue income of the other footy clubs. But I think it was a virtuous position. So I'm not saying an issue's too hard, but I am saying that in this sector, you've got to sit down and talk to people, convince them. A lot of what, and I'm not saying gambling is a particular example of this, but too much of politics now is people in their own castle shouting at everyone else. You've got to persuade people. You can't lecture them. When you understand that your opponent in an argument mightn't be a bad person or mightn't be all bad, even if you might say they're living on the wages of sin, I just make the point that people are capable of holding more than one view in their head. And maybe when we talk about any particular policy change, someone else feels threatened by it. And maybe you've got to try and unpack that sense of threat. Now, I'm not dumb. There are some vested financial interests who'll never buy any change because they're just making a lot of money on a bad system. But it's about persuading people. It's not just about lecturing them or yelling at them. These are hard, and you may think that's an obvious statement to make. Trust me, this is a hard-earned lesson, that you have to persuade people. You can't just automatically flick the switch to Saudi Arabia. And in a liberal democracy, persuasion actually counts. But there's a little town in central northern Italy called San Gimignano. I went there when I was a uni student backpacking. And it's a cute little town. It's on a hill, and it has 13 different towers. It's like quite well preserved from the medieval ages. And the interesting thing about the towers is they're quite high up off the ground, and they have holes where the family living in one tower would put down a plank and go and talk to another family who was lucky enough to own a tower, as opposed to the peasants just living in the swill down on the ground. But you realise it's an archaic form of life, isn't it? That the people in the towers would talk to each other from their own tower. There's a challenge, though, in that model of government, isn't there? And I think increasingly the internet, whilst it provides marvellous sources of information, I think we all thought the internet would democratise the world, and in fact, it's allowing people with absurd views to actually cluster, and then everyone shouts at each other on issues. So I know gambling's a tough issue, and my grandfather was a gambling addict for a long time. I've seen the harm it does. But as a more general point, I'm not really going to gambling here. How do we persuade people rather than how do we yell at them?
Bill is a lifelong member of the Liberal Party. I know that you'd be able to answer this question.
You all know David's joking, of course. You're allowed to laugh at his joke.
Could I say that over the last 10 years we have had a lack of collaborative discussions across the community around some of the wicked problems we face? You're still a new government. Where are the forums going to be developed where we can have input from across the community into some of these wicked problems we do face? I mean, you just raised the issue of obliquely housing. The church sector does sit on a lot of property. We don't have investment properties in the army, but we have a lot of properties and a lot of underutilised land. Where's the forum for bringing together the churches and other groups that do own that to develop policies and approaches where we might share our largesse? Where is the place where we struggle to deal with the wicked problems and discuss them in a way that the community can all share? Because I don't think we've had that for a while.
I could say the forum's Parliament, but then you would all laugh. And I'm not even going to say it's the Senate, because even I would laugh. No, it's better than that. But let me reverse your proposition, David. Why don't you folks set up the forum? There's no point waiting at a railway station if there's no railway track. So why don't you just set up your own forum? Why does it need someone else to tell you what to do?
Well, we have had peak bodies, Bill, but I think they've been emasculated in the last 10 to 15 years to some extent. So either we do need to re-energise those, or you're right, maybe create some row lines in the government.
The federal Labor government's going to be interested to talk. We've got a housing plan. We've set up a federal housing council. Some of that is happening. But if you've got a particular idea, when they made me the Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities, the NDIS didn't exist. Like, it didn't exist. We're not talking about changing a program. Dare I say it, it was like before there was light. The NDIS did not exist. And some of us decided to just create one. And then we built up the coalition for it. And now it's, as I said, 2% of the GDP. It's a world, nothing like it in the world. So it's a matter of identifying the purpose of the discussion and just leading. Just lead. As I know you've done on many occasions, David, in your efforts, but this is an opportunity for leadership. The beautiful thing about gaps, the beautiful thing about people who might be viewed as too hard or issues too hard, is there tends not to be a traffic jam of people ahead of you trying to solve the issue. Now, I like that myself. I don't want to necessarily deal with a whole lot of idiots. Like, I want to just... The other good thing about this but-for test is sometimes it means that you can just do it. You don't have to... And you get like-minded people and you build coalitions. You identify the gap. People recognise the gap when you tell them. So, I think that's an excellent idea, what you're saying. Work out what it is you need. Work out what it is it might cost. Work out what are the regulatory barriers. Work out what it's in for you to do it. How you can... Leadership is fun. It's difficult, it's annoying, it's frustrating, but it's also a heck of a lot of fun. Not having to take orders, but to actually create. That's a very good place to aim for. Be your own boss on the topic.
We've got a couple more questions, Jenny, do we?
Minister has the time. I'm happy to keep crawling.
Minutes.
Yep, couple more minutes.
Why don't we just get any of the contributions from you? Because as you can see, I'm like water. I can fill any space.
Hi, Bill. My name is Bethany. I'm a caseworker at Devonport, Tasmania. So where our sign is, across the road is our thrift store, and then next to that is a Services Australia building. Yep. So often we hear from the street frustrated community members who are exiting Services Australia, and they're frustrated and screaming profanities and that kind of thing. And it's from they don't feel like they're being heard. And then they come into our service and speak about how they feel like they haven't been heard. And then I'm also thinking of older Australians who have to use Services Australia, and they go into the building and they can't really talk to someone face to face. They get sent to the computers, and that can be quite intimidating for someone who's not computer literate. I love the idea of what you were sharing at 614 with having a Services Australia worker on site to, as you say, for the people who fall through the cracks, who are in the too hard basket and need perhaps that extra time and a different approach to access those services. Is there room for, I guess, funding, or is that approach being looked at for rural towns and other areas in Australia other than the big cities?
Why don't I get if there's another contribution? If there's not, I'll just wrap up on this. If there's not another contribution, I'll wrap up on that.
Thank you. My mum would have been very angry if I said Bill, because traditionally and culturally it's inappropriate. I have to say Mr. Shorten, but Bill.
No, all right, you're coming from a good place. I get it. That's fine.
I just wanted to add a couple of things to the list of people that are very much in a disadvantaged position when it comes to life in Australia, being this very amazing country. Our First Nations peoples and asylum seekers that are doing it really, really tough amongst the community. We know that our community members struggle day in, day out with a lot of things, and we know that the systems are in place to support them. But if we look at the system for Centrelink or NDIS, we see community members that absolutely struggle to navigate through those systems. So they've literally become the victims of a big beast that is a big beast for them. So if they miss a reporting, weekly reporting, they'll miss the payment and they'll come to TSA seeking support. Or if an NDIS single parent or an older carer is not able to navigate through the system, they would be dealing with very dodgy providers, or they end up not having the services provided to their people or loved ones with disabilities. I just want to pose a question, and you don't have to answer this, Bill. Could the government look at making life a bit easier and those systems a bit more friendlier for these people to navigate through? And how we as Salvation Army can play a role in partnership with the government to support you doing that, because we know that we've got the people on the ground and we are very capable of connecting with our communities because we are connected. One other question before you go, Bill. Salvation Army is a faith-based organisation, we know that, but not like other faith-based organisations. We have our sleeves rolled up every time, everything that happens in Australia, we're there, and globally we're present, and regardless of the faith of the person and the people and their backgrounds, we turn up and we do exactly what we would do for a Christian fellow. How could the government take a look at this as a very huge advantage of our organisation being faith-based, although regardless of the faith of the person, we would provide that equal support because we see people as people and humans, as opposed to labelling them with their faith and their background. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's deal with those two contributions, and I'm going to start with the second one first, and the very last point. I think the Salvation Army brings a lot to the table. I really do. I think you've also got a very strong brand in the community, which has been earned. And I think a lot of Australians who might be uncomfortable with demonstrations of faith, that doesn't mean they don't have it, but not everyone wants to sort of be filmed going to church or doing a press conference at a church. But I think the Salvos have got a brand which is accessible for a lot of Australians. And you see it through your Red Shield appeal. You see it through that sense that you do really look at and support the most marginalised in very practical ways. That's why I mentioned, for example, food insecurity or loneliness, or there's, you do a lot of things really well. So I think the government's aware of that. I really do. In terms of equity and accessing the system, I think with the NDI, I know with the NDIS because I'm working on it, we're going to provide, a review's been done. It's currently we're dealing with those interesting people called state governments, because the NDIS is in danger of becoming the only lifeboat in the ocean. If you can get on it, it's excellent. It's got plenty of problems, but it is much better than not being on it. It wasn't designed for every Australian with a disability, but for those with the most severe disabilities. But a lot of states have vacated the field in providing what we call foundational services. Sometimes if you've got a child with a developmental delay, you don't need hour upon hour of individual therapy, but parents need somewhere they can go where they can talk to other parents. You might just need a play group. So I do think there's an opportunity for the Salvos to help lift the support for the disabled outside the NDIS. And I know the governments will look in a very interested way at that and how we can work with you on that. But this equity issue about access, there's other reforms we can make. It's almost a two-class system. if you know the right language, you've got the right reports written, you can get in, and if you don't, like many of the groups you just mentioned, you miss out. So I think we've got to find a way of creating a more equitable gateway into the scheme, a more human experience. So watch this space. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at some of the propositions we advance. That might even go to help paying for initial reports. So you don't have to get together the case to get the money, but a sort of a better initial support so we can just get over some of those initial hurdles. Because I do agree outcomes are inequitable. But then there's also being in the system. Somehow the scheme's been allowed to evolve in the last 10 years from when we created it to now. We have 15,000 or so registered providers and 85,000 unregistered providers. This is not a sustainable proposition. I've set up what's called a fraud fusion task force to deal with criminal conduct, and we're going to have more there's literally human trafficking going on. Someone might have a severe intellectual disability, might be just out of jail. They've got a package. Now all of a sudden they're valuable to people who run boarding houses. And honestly, the packages get mined, literally exploited. So we want to crack down on not just criminal behaviour, but unethical behaviour. That means I've got to increase the resources and the proactive nature of the safeguards regulator, which we're doing. Means that we want to actually get some of the crooks out of the scheme, which we're doing. But also then there's just everyday good old Aussie business practice where there's almost a wedding tax in the scheme where if you don't have an NDIS package, you get charged one rate, but as soon as they hear you've got an NDIS package, you get charged another rate. I'm going to make that illegal. This is not just big talk at the Salvos because I want to impress you and make 150 new friends. We're going to do this. It's really good. And it's going to be dramatic and it'll be very interesting. And I'll no doubt get more hate mail in my inbox from providers. But we also want to help. There's a lot of good providers. We want to decrease the red tape. But the other thing is, under the previous government, they sort of paid the money. They sprayed it into the ecosystem, but they didn't worry about was there a trained workforce. They didn't worry if the services are actually based on evidence sufficiently. The previous government always used to worry if an NDIS package could be used to go to a prostitute, but they didn't seem to worry about anything else. Anyway, that's just they're funny people. So we want to make sure that there's evidence-based support. But one thing happens though in the scheme is that once you get your package, you've got to work it out yourself, so you pay for plan managers. Well, they weren't in part of the original design of the scheme. But a whole industry has been created to help you spend your money without any view from the NDIA or the agency how to use it. So we're going to look at how we can give people someone consistent, either from the agency or from, if they're complex needs, or from different organisations, just to be your navigator in the scheme. So you've got the same person you can ring. And just having the same person to ring is a big start. I know it sounds very basic, but it seemed to be beyond the capacity of the last 10 years. So we're going to announce a whole lot of reforms on that, and I think that'll go to your equity points that you make about that scheme. But I think what you're also saying, what Stephanie was saying, is about access to the system, generally, the safety net. We might have a universal safety net, but if you can't access it, it's not universal. Services, when we talk about delivery of services, there should be outreach work, and we're starting to pioneer that a bit. I think it used to happen, but now we're bringing that back. But also, the people who work in the service centres have been treated as fodder, I think, by the governments in previous times. So those frontline staff. We're increasing some of their protections. I was able to announce last Monday 3,000 extra public servants. There's just so much to be done. It's like the jaws of a snake dealing with government services. On one hand, demand is up, so that's one part of it. But then the other part is that we are at the lowest per capita public servant to head of population in Federation. So more to be done with less people to do it. So of course that means that the people who come to your thrift shop, no wonder they're frustrated because the people they're dealing with are frustrated. We've removed KPIs that you have to see a certain person every 6 minutes. We're changing the letters that we write to people. I've reinstituted the Community Services Advisory Committee. Yesterday in Sydney, I announced a new advisory group that whenever Service Australia has a new idea, we're going to run it past an advisory board. They're there as individuals, but I've got someone who used to run Economic Justice Australia. Do you know, for the next head of Services Australia, and there's a vacancy right now, there's 2 departmental secretaries on the interview panel, the head of the Public Service Commission, and I got someone from the community services sector, Leanne Ho, who used to run Economic Justice Australia. She's but she's not representing them, but she's someone who's only ever been on the side of the people you're talking about. She's interviewing, she will be part of the group who give me the shortlist for the next boss of Services Australia. This is a radical departure. Imagine if you're applying for a job in the Salvos and one of the street people gets to be on the interview panel. Now, I'm not saying that Leanne Ho's like a particular consumer, but you see what I'm getting at? And when I employed the new head of the NDIA, we got a disability advocate as part of the shortlisting panel. The way you show you're serious is in a whole lot of little acts. So we do provide computers. So we have sub-agencies for Centrelink. We've committed to the reduction, no net reduction in service centres. We've put on 3,000 extra bodies to help with payment waiting time and call waiting time, which is disastrous because it's been cut so low. We're also redesigning the governance of the agency in those sort of ways I'm demonstrating to you. So there is a bit happening. Our social workers in Central Service Australia are outstanding. There's just not enough of them. Our financial information service officers, FISOs, they're just brilliant. We've got to get more of them. There's aged care advisors. We need more of them. So I back our public service. We've got to give them more resources. We take away the KPIs. Far better to take longer to deal with a person than have to them come in 3 different times. And we are prioritising accuracy of payments because then you have less mistakes. The best way not to have an argument is just get the initial decision right. We're also revamping the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, so we make it a more user-friendly approach. So I think we are working on a range of ways. In terms of it was Brendan Noddle and I who cooked up this idea of doing outreach. He once said to me, really handy to have someone at Project 614 rather than we've got to go down to the local printing shop to get a fax or, just the amount of time it takes up of your workers running around on stuff where if we can get you someone trained from Service Australia with the computer at the venue, it's great for the mental health, not just of your clients, but of you. Because the last thing you want to do is become a de facto paper pusher. And for as good as you are, there's people in the Service Australia who can just do it a lot quicker. Some of those, so you're asking about regions, we put a couple of those in the regions already, but I want to change the approach of the agency and the culture of the agency. I want to make the staff feel safer, I want them to feel more appreciated, I want more of them. But then I also want to shake up the leadership. I want them to understand that, the outcome isn't the new digital program in the payment system, it's someone getting paid. But they're doing it. There's a lot of good people, and you're all good people, and I don't outstay my welcome. It's always good to leave a party while you're having fun. Goodbye. Thank you. You've been a great one.
Thank you. Bill has been very generous with his time. He does not do it grudgingly, though, because I know that for Bill, this is the substance of politics. It is being with people who are delivering services to those most in need. So thank you, Bill.